Hey guys, tonight we drift back to a time when the world felt smaller, colder, and far more mysterious. A time when the long winters of the north seemed to last forever, and the people who lived beneath that frozen sky believed that unseen gods moved through the darkness, listening for the sound of devotion. Before we begin, take a moment to like the video, subscribe if you haven't already, and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. I always find it quietly fascinating to see how far this little corner of history reaches. Now, turn down the lights, maybe let a candle flicker or a fan hum softly in the background. Let your room grow still, and let your mind wander north, far beyond the edge of the map, where frost never fully melts, and the wind still carries the names of gods no one prays to anymore. Tonight, we'll explore what the Viking gods demanded in the dark of night, not in thunder and conquest, but in silence, ritual, and the quiet persistence of belief. So, settle in. Let's set the scene. In the far north of the ancient world, where the sun slipped below the horizon and forgot to rise again for weeks at a time, life was bound to darkness in a way few can now imagine. The year did not turn through neat seasons but through long stretches of light and longer stretches of shadow. For the people who lived there, the ancestors of what we now call the Norse or Vikings, time itself moved differently. It was not a steady march, but a kind of breathing. Light exhaled, darkness inhaled, and between the two, humanity waited. During those months when daylight faded into a dull grey that never truly became day, everything slowed. Frost grew like glass over timber walls, and even the air seemed to hang in place, thick and unmoving. Men rose not to clocks but to the stirring of the hearth fire, to the sound of livestock shifting in their stalls, or to the muffled call of ravens circling a frozen field. Women moved quietly, tending the faint glow of embers that might die if left alone. The boundary between sleep and waking was indistinct. It was said that dreams were longer in winter, that they crept into waking hours, and that in those dreams one could almost hear the gods breathing. The northern lands, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, were not unified kingdoms then, but small worlds of their own, clusters of farmsteads surrounded by forests, seas, and snowfields. Each valley had its chieftain, each island its stories. The landscape itself felt ancient, as though carved before memory began. Mountains rose like petrified waves, fjords cut deep into the land like old wounds filled with salt and time, and through it all ran the hush of winter, so deep and constant that even whispers seemed to echo for miles. To live in such a world required not only endurance but reverence. Nature was not separate from life, it was life. The wind was not simply weather, it was a messenger from something greater. The ice was not dead. It creaked, sighed, and spoke in the language of the gods. The people of the north learned early that survival was not guaranteed. The harvest could fail, the sea could swallow whole families. A sudden storm could erase the path between one house and another. So they made peace with uncertainty by giving it a face, a name, a mythology. These were not the soft, benevolent gods of later centuries. They were beings of immense power and complexity, as fierce and cold as the landscape itself. Odin, who traded his eye for wisdom and hung upon the world tree to learn the secrets of death. Thor, whose hammer roared like thunder and split the skies to protect mankind. Freyja, whose beauty could ignite both passion and war. Loki, the restless shapeshifter, never entirely trusted yet never entirely condemned. To the Norse, these figures were not distant deities dwelling in unreachable heavens. They were forces woven into the fabric of existence, the flicker in the fire, the whisper in the wind, the shadow between the stars. At night, when the world outside turned black and the cold pressed close against the walls, families gathered near the hearth. The flames painted slow-moving shapes across the room, and the smoke curled upward into the beams, carrying with it prayers no one spoke aloud. It was in such hours between wakefulness and sleep that the gods were thought to draw near. The old sagas, later written down by Icelandic scholars like Snorri Sturluson, speak of these moments with quiet certainty, that Odin wandered the earth in disguise, that spirits walked beside men, and that the veil between worlds was thinnest when the night was longest. In the hush of those northern winters, belief was not a matter of choice. It was as natural as breathing. The gods were everywhere because something had to be. Without them, the silence would have been unbearable. Without them, the long dark might have felt endless. The people looked to the heavens and found no comfort in empty stars, so they filled the sky with meaning, constellations that told of wolves chasing the sun, of a serpent encircling the earth, of fate itself bound in thread and iron. Firelight became the measure of life. Each home or longhouse was a universe of its own. Its walls, built of timber and turf, were thick enough to keep out the worst of the cold, but thin enough that the howl of the wind could still be heard. Inside, the air smelled of smoke, pine resin, wool, and the faint tang of salted fish. Children drifted to sleep wrapped in furs, while elders muttered stories that had been told for generations. These were not merely tales for amusement. They were survival manuals written in metaphor. They reminded listeners that the gods demanded respect, that the land had rules, and that defiance brought ruin. Archaeological evidence and medieval sources alike describe how this environment shaped Norse society. Their calendars marked time not by months as we know them, but by events: the first frost, the deep snow, the thaw. Rituals like Yule, known in Old Norse as Jol, arose from this cycle. It was not originally a festival of joy, but one of endurance. It marked the darkest days of the year, when offerings were made to the gods to ensure the return of the sun. Historians trace its origins long before Christianity's Christmas, noting that even the word Yule survives as a linguistic echo of that ancient ceremony. The Norse were not naive dreamers inventing stories for comfort. They were practical, observant people who understood the fragility of existence. Their gods reflected that understanding. Odin's wisdom was won through suffering. Thor's protection came through violence. Freyja's love was bound to death. Nothing came without a cost. This belief system mirrored the rhythms of the natural world they inhabited, harsh, cyclical, and inescapably balanced. And so, in those long nights when the snow buried the roads and the stars burned low, people learned to wait. Waiting itself became a kind of faith. The sound of the wind through the trees could be a warning or a blessing, depending on what the gods decided. The line between fear and reverence blurred until they were almost the same. To live was to accept both. The Norse called their land Midgard, the middle realm, suspended between the fires of the gods and the frost of giants. It was not a metaphor to them, but a truth as tangible as the ground beneath their feet. Every storm, every silence, every flicker of light in the cold sky carried a message from the divine. And in that long night, where day never truly began, humanity existed, not in defiance of darkness but within it, bound to it, shaped by it. The winter's hold seemed eternal, but in the stillness of snow and breath, something ancient stirred. The people who watched the skies knew that nothing lasted forever, not even the night. They believed that beyond the horizon of shadow, light was gathering strength, and when it finally returned, it would reveal the world anew. And as the faintest trace of dawn began to creep back into the frozen air, the story of the gods themselves began to take shape, not as legends written in books, but as living forces whispered from one fire to another, binding an entire world together in quiet faith. The faint dawn that touched the snow was not a warm one. It spread like pale smoke across the horizon, illuminating a world that had long since forgotten gentleness. The land of the north was a vast, restless creature, breathing through mist, ice, and the endless sigh of wind. It stretched from the coasts of Norway and Denmark to the silent forests of Sweden and the volcanic edges of Iceland, bound together by cold and by memory. Everything here moved slowly. The mountains did not simply rise, they endured. They watched centuries pass, their slopes carved by glaciers that crept like patient ghosts. Beneath them lay valleys where rivers froze into crystal ribbons and thawed again with the turning of the year. The sea was never still. It churned grey and heavy, as if it too were alive, tasting salt and storm. Even the trees, bent and thin, seemed to lean away from the wind in silent submission. Nothing in this land was soft, yet everything possessed its own quiet rhythm, a steady pulse beneath the surface of frost. It was from this landscape that the Norse imagination was born. The sagas, written centuries later, were not inventions but reflections of this environment, of how it felt to stand beneath a sky that never ended, to hear the crack of ice splitting on a fjord, or to see firelight dance across snow while the wind howled like a living thing. The people of these lands were shaped not by conquest or empire, but by endurance. They learned to live with scarcity, to wait through long winters, and to take their meaning from the land itself. Archaeological evidence and medieval chronicles alike confirm how deeply geography and belief intertwined in early Scandinavian life. The earliest Norse settlements were often built along fjords and near forests, where both fishing and wood could sustain life. Farms were few and small, perched on patches of soil between rock and sea. There was little room for luxury, yet even in this austerity, a kind of artistry flourished. Carved wood, woven patterns, intricate jewelry, not born from wealth, but from time. The endless dark hours gave space for creation, and in those creations the gods took shape. The Norse did not imagine their deities as perfect or distant beings. They were mirrors of the world around them. Odin, the wanderer, embodied the cold intelligence of survival, wisdom gained through pain, through sacrifice. Thor was the echo of thunder rolling down mountain passes, his hammer the storm itself made visible. Freyja was the shimmer of beauty that existed despite the cold, like the glint of sun on ice or the sudden bloom of life in spring. Their pantheon was not invented from nothing. It rose naturally, like steam from the frozen ground. To them the land was alive in a way that modern eyes can hardly grasp. Each rock, stream and tree possessed its own vatir, a spirit or presence that demanded respect. The sagas mention these beings almost casually, as though everyone knew them personally. Travelers would leave offerings of bread or milk near stones before a journey. Fishermen spoke to the sea as if it could hear, and perhaps they believed it could. The boundary between myth and landscape was not a line at all, but a fog, drifting and blending. In these northern places, one could not easily separate religion from survival. The climate itself demanded reverence. Snow could fall for months, sealing villages in silence. Storms could sink ships before they ever left sight of shore. To the Norse, such forces were not random. They were the moods of gods and spirits who watched, tested, and sometimes punished. When crops failed, it was said the gods had turned away. When a whale washed ashore, or the aurora shimmered above the mountains, it was a sign of their attention returning. The sagas preserved glimpses of this worldview, and even though they were written centuries after the Viking Age by Christian scribes, they retain that deep undercurrent of natural awe. In the Prose Edda, the world begins not in light or order, but in contrast. The frozen realm of Niflheim, meeting the fiery world of Muspelheim, and from their collision came life. That myth was not abstract. It reflected the daily experience of those who saw fire and ice coexist in their own world. Volcanoes rising through glaciers, warmth and cold locked in eternal struggle. Every part of Norse cosmology echoed something visible. The great ash tree Yggdrasil, said to connect all the worlds, might have been inspired by the immense solitary trees that stood above the northern forests, their roots hidden in frost and their branches reaching into the fog. Beneath its roots lay Hel, the realm of the dead, not a place of torment but of quiet rest. Above in Asgard, lived the gods, a reflection of high places, mountains unreachable, yet always visible. The myths were geography written in poetry. When people spoke of the gods in these lands, they did not do so with fear in their voices, but with familiarity. The gods were demanding, yes, but they were also close. They were neighbors in the wilderness, companions in isolation. In some regions, certain deities were revered more than others. In Norway, Thor's protection was favored among seafarers. In Sweden, Freya's fertility was invoked for crops. In Iceland, Odin's wisdom and magic held sway. Local traditions varied, just as the terrain did, yet all shared the same elemental foundation, a belief that existence was fragile and divine in equal measure. It is difficult now to picture what those nights must have felt like. Imagine standing outside beneath a sky where the stars seem to move, where the cold is so sharp it burns your lungs, and where every sound, the creak of snow, the cry of an unseen bird, feels magnified. To the people of the north, this was not emptiness, it was presence. The darkness was full of watching things, and though not all were kind, all were necessary. Even now, when historians and archaeologists unearth remnants of this world, tools, runestones, fragments of temples, there lingers in them that same stillness. The carvings are intricate, yet restrained. The inscriptions often speak of death, honor, and offering, but rarely of comfort. The Norse did not build paradise, they built endurance. Their gods were not meant to protect them from the world, but to help them endure it. As the brief northern dawn fades once more into grey, one begins to understand why their myths took root so deeply. The landscape did not merely inspire stories, it demanded them. In every gust of wind, in every crack of ice, there was the whisper of creation, and from those whispers rose an entire belief system, harsh, beautiful, and unyielding as the land itself. And when the snow began to fall again, coating the fields and forests in quiet uniformity, it seemed almost as if the earth were breathing, slow, deliberate, eternal. The people who lived within that breath carried its rhythm in their hearts, and from it, their gods continued to take form, waiting to be named in the dark. Under the same grey dawn that revealed the bones of the northern landscape, the stories began to take shape. They were not written at first, nor carved in runes, but spoken softly, passed from one hearth to another. Smoke carried them upward. Snow muffled their endings. They changed with every retelling, yet something constant remained beneath. A belief that the world itself had been built out of violence and wonder, out of something immense that had to be tamed for life to exist at all. In those earliest tales, before the sagas and before Christianity would later write them down, the world did not begin in light. It began in a void called Ginnungagap, a word that meant the yawning nothing. On one side of this void lay Niflheim, a realm of ice and mist. On the other Muspelheimsir, a place of eternal fire. When heat met frost, it did not end in destruction but creation. Drops of melting ice became the first living thing. A giant called Ymir. From Ymir's body, new life flowed. The frost giants, cold and powerful, older than any god. But creation demanded order, and order demanded sacrifice. The stories said that the first gods, Odin and his brothers, Vili and Ve, rose from this early chaos, and saw that the world could not last while the giant lived. So they killed Ymir, and from his body they made everything that was. His blood became the oceans, his flesh, the earth, his bones, the mountains. From his skull they shaped the dome of the sky, and from the sparks of Muspelheim they made the stars. The story has the rhythm of something remembered rather than invented, echoing the world the Norse already knew. One where creation and destruction were inseparable. For the people of the North, these tales were not allegory. They were memory in another form, an explanation of why the world was both beautiful and cruel. To them, it made sense that the earth was made from a corpse. Life was sustained only by death. Every harvest, every hunt, every winter Thor carried that same balance. Even the gods themselves, born of violence, understood that survival demanded taking as much as giving. Odin, who would become the highest of them, was never simply a benevolent father. He was a wanderer, a seeker, and a manipulator of fate. His quest for knowledge defined him more than his rule. Legends tell that he plucked out his own eye and offered it to Mimir's well, the well of wisdom, in exchange for sight beyond sight. He hung himself upon the great world tree, Yggdrasil, pierced by his own spear, and dangled there for 9 nights until he learned the runes, symbols of power and language. His knowledge came from pain, and that truth echoed through the Norse understanding of life. To know was to suffer, to live was to risk. Thor, by contrast, embodied the raw force of the natural world. He was strength and sound, thunder rolling down from the mountains, storms breaking over the sea. His hammer, Mjolnir, was both weapon and blessing. With it he crushed giants, enemies of order, but he also consecrated marriages and births. In him, destruction and protection were one. Farmers prayed to him for fair weather, sailors for safe voyages. Archaeologists have found countless small Thor's hammer amulets buried with men and women alike. tokens not of aggression but of reassurance. And then there was Freyja, whose name meant lady, but whose roles defied easy translation. She was beauty and war, love and death, fertility and sorcery. Half of those who died in battle were said to go not to Odin's hall, Valhalla, but to hers, Folkvangr. Her chariot, drawn by cats, moved between worlds. Women called upon her for childbirth, men for courage. She embodied both desire and mourning, a reminder that passion and loss were never far apart. Together these figures formed the heart of Norse belief. They were not untouchable or eternal. They were flawed, capricious and bound by fate just as humans were. Even the gods could not escape the end. The stories foretold a final battle called Ragnarok when the sky would break and gods and giants alike would fall. The Norse accepted this not as tragedy, but as truth. Everything, even divinity, must pass. It is telling that the Norse gods lived in a world so human in its structure. They fought, feasted, deceived, and wept. They were closer to forces of nature than to moral ideals. When the wind tore through the fjords or lightning split the sea, it was not an act of divine punishment, but of participation, the gods moving through their own creation. To the people who told these stories, this made the gods more real, not less. The divine was not perfection, it was presence. In the flickering half-light of longhouses, such tales served as more than mythology. They were a way of remembering who the people were. They told of struggle, endurance, and inevitability, themes that mirrored every winter, every voyage, every harvest that failed or succeeded. The myth of Ymir's body becoming the world was, in essence, the myth of survival, that from what dies, something new is always born. When modern scholars like Snorri Sturluson compiled these tales in the Prose Edda during the 13th century, centuries after Christianity had reached Scandinavia, they were preserving echoes of oral traditions that had already aged like stone. Yet, even in Snorri's Christian lens, the rawness of the old myths remains. His Odin is still ruthless, his Thor still fierce, his Freyja still mourns as much as she loves. The core of the old faith, that the universe was alive, cyclical, and ultimately indifferent, persisted. For those who once listened to these stories under low roofs and long winters, they carried not despair but clarity. The gods were proof that struggle was sacred, that even they, born from chaos, fought against inevitable decay. The myths rose naturally from the mountains, the seas, and the storm, from the very same breath of the Old North that shaped the people who told them. And so, as the night deepened and the last ember in the hearth settled into ash, the voices that spoke of Odin and Thor and Freyja were not simply telling stories. They were repeating a truth that felt older than words, that the world itself, like the gods, was made from endurance, and that somewhere beyond the silence, the wind was still carrying their names. In the long darkness of a northern winter, when frost thickened on the inside of the roof beams and the oil lamps burned low, the night sometimes felt heavier than air. It settled into corners, beneath benches, inside the folds of furs. The people who lived in that world did not expect silence to be empty. Silence to them was the hour when something unseen passed nearby. They believed that the gods, or the spirits who served them, could walk the earth after sunset, not in the blinding spectacle of thunder or the rush of daylight, but quietly, as a pressure in the air, as a subtle tremor in the floorboards. The Norse word vata was used for such presences, beings of the land, sea and home, who bridged the divide between divine and natural. A creaking door or a sudden draft was not simply coincidence, it could be a god's passing glance, or a land spirit's discontent. So in barns and boats, on lonely hillsides, and by river crossings, men and women left small gestures of respect. A carved piece of bread placed on a beam, a bowl of ale poured out to the soil, milk spilled deliberately, not wasted, but gifted. These offerings were quiet acknowledgments, a way of keeping balance in a world that demanded humility. They were not made for spectacle, they were made to be unseen, to vanish into the cold night before morning. The sagas and poems that have survived tell us that this relationship between humans and gods was not built on certainty, but on negotiation. Odin, the All-Father, was not a kindly protector. He was a wanderer, a manipulator, a keeper of hidden knowledge. He required wisdom, but also submission. Thor was strength and noise and thunder, yet even he could be unpredictable, turning his hammer not only on giants, but sometimes on men who displeased him. To live among such gods meant to live with unease. The Vikings believed that what existed between worlds was porous. The boundary between life and death, man and god, sea and sky, all could be crossed, if one knew the right way to ask. In some stories, the gods themselves took human form to test mortals' generosity or courage. In others, the dead returned for a night's visit, drawn back by unfinished bonds or unspoken oaths. There were no sharp lines in their cosmology, only shifting shades of dusk. The rituals that grew from these beliefs varied by region and season. In Iceland, there were the blots, sacrifices and feasts held at temples or farmsteads. The Old Norse word blot simply meant to worship, or to strengthen through offering. What exactly was offered depended on the time and the place: food, mead, animal blood, or the first portion of a harvest. Archaeological excavations at sites such as Hofstøðir and Upåkra show evidence of ceremonial feasting, bones split open for marrow, and traces of ale near what were once altars. Blood, to the Vikings, was not only life, it was a link, sprinkled across stones or carved idols. It symbolized the binding of worlds, the renewal of an ancient covenant between gods and humans. The act was not seen as gruesome, but as necessary, like lighting a fire to keep night at bay. Through these gestures, the people sought favor for the seasons to come, good weather, safe voyages, fertile livestock, but sometimes the offerings became heavier in meaning. There were whispers, preserved by medieval chroniclers, of greater sacrifices, of kings who gave up their lives to Odin for victory in war, of prisoners offered to the sea for calm winds. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described such rituals at the Temple of Uppsala, where men and beasts were hung in the sacred grove. Yet historians treat these accounts carefully. They were written by outsiders, Christian observers interpreting what they did not fully understand. Excavations at Gamla Uppsala have revealed evidence of ritual feasts and bones, but not the grisly spectacles described by foreign eyes. The truth, as always, is quieter. The Viking relationship with the divine was built more on rhythm than on blood, on recurring acts of respect, on the understanding that power demanded acknowledgement. A simple carving of Thor's hammer worn around the neck, a stone raised to honor a dead father, a whisper of Heil's Odin before a voyage. These were the true moments of devotion, small persistent gestures made in the face of an unpredictable world. And still, in those moments of darkness when the lamps burned out and the wind pressed against the wooden walls, people felt something beyond themselves. The sagas speak of Drottningar, restless spirits who walked in the night, guarding their buried wealth or haunting those who wronged them. They tell of Nis, the small, house-bound spirits who could bless or curse a farm depending on how well they were treated. Whether these were ghosts, gods, or merely reflections of fear, no one could say. What mattered was the feeling that the night itself was alive, that somewhere, in the unseen spaces between heartlight and snow, something listened. The world the Vikings inhabited was not divided between sacred and profane. It was all one continuous presence, shifting like mist. Every gust of wind could carry a message. Every animal might be a god's messenger. When they stepped outside under the winter sky, with stars so sharp they seemed to hum, they felt the breath of something vast pressing close. The gods were not distant figures in the heavens. They were the cold, the storm, the hunger, the will to endure. And in that understanding, the night lost some of its terror, because to live in a world full of listening gods was to never truly be alone. The weight of their attention, that faint whisper in the rafters, became a kind of company. The people learned to live with it, to feed it, to speak softly into it when words failed. It was not belief as we imagine it today. It was participation in a conversation that had no end. carried on through ritual, silence, and story. And in that endless conversation, the night itself began to speak back. By midwinter, the sun no longer climbed high enough to clear the treetops. Days were brief, like the exhale of a sleeping god, and the world seemed caught between waking and oblivion. The snow lay unmoving, thick and old, creaking faintly underfoot like wood that remembered another age. For the Norse, this was the hardest and most sacred season, when light itself became a fragile thing, and men had to help keep it alive. They called it Jul, a word that stretched back beyond writing, older even than the gods' familiar names. Its meaning was layered, a festival, a turning, a reckoning of time. In the sagas, kings and farmers alike held it, and though the details varied, the spirit of the rite was constant. It was a keeping of faith with the returning sun. For as long as anyone could remember, the people had marked the longest nights with flame. Fires were built on frozen ground, and the scent of burning pine bled into the air, mingling with the smell of mead and tallow. In great halls, men gathered in furs, their breath clouding above tankards, their laughter low and slow, like an old song remembered imperfectly. Outside, in the dark beyond the firelight, cattle slept under hoarfrost, and the stars looked like holes burned through the roof of the world. Jol was not a single night, but a stretch of them, sometimes 13, sometimes more. During this time, the boundaries between the living and the unseen world thinned. The Husa, the gods of Asgard, were honored with feasts and drink. The Alfar, the spirits of ancestors, were given offerings of ale or bread. The sagas tell us that these rituals carried a sense of both celebration and unease, for while it was a time of warmth and kinship, it was also a time when the dead might walk, drawn by the smoke and song. In many settlements, the centerpiece of the celebration was the Yule fire, a great log that burned slowly through the nights. Fed with careful attention, every spark and ember carried a kind of hope, a promise that light would return. It was said that if the fire died before the final night, it was a bad omen, a sign that the coming year would be harsh or unlucky. In the smaller farms scattered across the valleys and fjords, families performed quieter rituals. They lit torches at the door to welcome the returning sun, even though it would not appear for weeks. They brewed ale and shared the first drink with the gods, pouring a little on the ground in thanks. They slaughtered animals that could not survive the winter, sheep, goats, pigs, and used every part, turning necessity into devotion. The act of survival became sacred, and the feast itself was an offering. At Uppsala, the great temple said to have been dedicated to Odin, Thor, and Freya. Later chroniclers wrote of midwinter sacrifices meant to secure the favor of the gods for the coming year. The historian Adam of Bremen described 9-day ceremonies in which both men and animals were hanged in a grove sacred to Odin. Modern scholars, however, find the truth more nuanced. Excavations suggest that Uppsala was indeed a ritual center, but the evidence points more to grand communal feasts, processions, and symbolic offerings rather than constant violence. The power of Jol lay in continuity, not in cruelty. Fire and ale were its true symbols, warmth and memory preserved against oblivion. To share a drink was to renew the bonds of kinship. To keep a flame was to echo the first fires of creation, when the world was born from the meeting of ice and heat in the void of Ginnungagap. As the mead passed from hand to hand, toasts were made in sequence, first to Odin, for victory and wisdom, then to Njörður and Freya for peace and abundance, and finally to the memory of the ancestors. Each cup was raised not only to gods, but to the unseen threads that bound the living to those who had come before. The Norse word minni, meaning remembrance, lay at the heart of these rites, a kind of drinking in honor of what must not be forgotten. Through this ritual of remembrance, the fire on the frozen earth became more than light. It became a bridge between past and future, gods and men, warmth and winter. Every spark rising into the dark was a small defiance against the endless cold, and somewhere in that exchange, belief was renewed, not through preaching or fear, but through shared endurance. Even the landscape seemed to participate. The snow reflected the firelight so that the night glowed faintly red, as though the world itself were smoldering. Ravens perched on the rafters of the halls, watching with their pale, intelligent eyes. The air hummed faintly with the rhythm of the chants, old verses from the Havamal, or fragments of songs whose words no longer had meaning, but whose sounds still carried power. In the stillness after the feast, when only the logs cracked in the hearth and the mead had dulled every sharp thought, the Norse might feel something stir beyond the firelight. Not fear, exactly, but presence. The gods did not appear in visions or thunder, but in the ordinary persistence of flame, in the warmth that refused to die. It was enough to know they listened, enough to trust that the long dark would end, and when the first faint light of returning dawn finally brushed the horizon, it was not just the sun they welcomed, but the proof that the old covenants still held. The fire had kept its promise. The gods had guarded the spark of life through the longest night. The people would soon return to their work, repairing ships, tending fields, mending nets, but something within them remained tied to that moment of warmth in the frozen world. It was the memory of endurance made visible, the human echo of divine fire, and so the world turned, slowly, back toward light, carrying with it the ashes of the fires that once kept the gods awake through the winter. When the fires of Joel burned low, and only faint embers glowed against the ash, the stories turned to him, the grey wanderer, the god who asked for more than warmth or words. Odin was never a gentle presence. He was the one who travelled the world in disguise, who watched through storm and smoke, who weighed men not by their courage in battle, but by what they were willing to give up to see beyond it. In the stillness that followed feasting, when sleep came slow and the hall smelled of pine smoke and old ale, the elders spoke of Odin's bargains. They said he was not worshipped in the same way as the others. Thor might be called for protection, Freya for harvest, but Odin's devotion came with risk. He demanded not obedience, but offering, the kind that left a mark. He was a god of seether, of hidden knowledge, of the thin paths between life and death. The old poems say he once sought the secrets of the runes, those carved symbols that held power over fate and the world itself. To gain them, he hung for 9 nights upon the windswept branches of Yggdrasil, the great ash tree that bound all realms together. No bread, no drink, only pain and silence. When he fell, he did not return as he had been. He had learned the shapes of meaning, the patterns beneath existence. He had seen too much, and for that knowledge, he gave one of his eyes. It was said he left it in the waters of Mimir's well, deep beneath the roots of the world tree. The eye looked upward through the water forever, unblinking, watching both the living and the dead. It was a symbol that every secret comes at a price, and that even gods must trade to know. Men took this to heart. The warriors who followed Odin knew that life itself was a kind of wager. They called themselves Einherjar, the chosen slain, those who would fight, die, and be carried to Valhalla, his hall of the fallen, to train for the final battle at Ragnarök. Death was not an end but an initiation, and courage in the face of it was its own kind of sacrifice. Among chieftains and kings, devotion to Odin often meant the same, offering part of oneself, sometimes blood, sometimes breath, sometimes the burden of command. The sagas tell of kings like Vikar and Oln, men who sought Odin's favor, and in turn offered their own years or lives in exchange for victory or wisdom. The truth behind those stories may be lost in myth, yet the pattern remains clear. Odin was the god of costly exchanges. His presence haunted the edges of ordinary life. In war he was seen in the shape of ravens circling the field, in the hiss of wind through spear shafts, in the sudden stillness before combat began. In peace he was the whisper behind decisions that could not be undone. When the people carved the runes, they invoked his name softly, tracing his gift into wood or bone. The rune answers was his, the sign of breath, of spirit, of speech and insight. But to draw it was also to invite the weight of awareness. Odin's demands were not measured in flesh alone. He required introspection, the surrender of certainty. He asked mortals to see as he saw, to look beyond comfort, to embrace the cold vastness of what lay outside human knowing. In this his worship was a discipline of endurance. The wanderer who followed Odin's path became a seeker, marked by both wisdom and weariness. And yet he was not only the god of kings and warriors. Among those who practiced Seither, the ancient Norse magic of trance, prophecy and transformation, Odin was also a master. He learned this art from the goddess Freya, crossing boundaries that his own followers would later call shameful. For Seither was a craft of the feminine and the hidden. In doing so, Odin demonstrated again that power demanded sacrifice, not only of life, but of identity and pride. In Icelandic poems like the Ynglinga saga, Snorri Sturluson describes how Odin's worship involved ritual gestures meant to mirror his own suffering. Hanging, fasting, or enduring pain were not necessarily acts of cruelty, but of communion, ways to touch the divine ordeal that had once birthed knowledge into the world. Whether such rites were symbolic or real, they reflected the belief that enlightenment could never be taken lightly. To live under Odin's gaze was to live with constant awareness of cost. A fisherman might offer the first catch of the season to the sea, whispering a name into the waves. A poet might burn a lock of hair before composing a verse, seeking inspiration from the same god who had stolen the mead of poetry from the giants. Even simple acts could become sacred transactions, small echoes of the larger myth. Because Odin himself was not whole, he was the sum of his sacrifices, the god who had bled, hung, wandered, and seen. His wisdom came not from perfection but from loss, and the people understood that truth better than most. They knew that to live in the north was to surrender constantly. Warmth, food, kin, time, the gods merely reflected that endurance back at them. By firelight, the skalds would recite his many names: the one-eyed, the all-father, the raven god, the gallows lord, and each name was a facet of the same lesson, that knowledge, courage, and fate were inseparable. The Norse did not pray for mercy. They prayed for strength to meet what came, and for clarity enough to understand its meaning. When storms rose and ships vanished into fog, people said Odin had claimed his due. When a warrior died well, his friends said the god had smiled. When an old man dreamed of ravens, it was an omen that someone nearby had seen too deeply. These were not fears, they were acknowledgments, small nods to the idea that the divine world was not kind, but it was consistent. And so, under the cold stars, they lived by that rhythm. To know was to pay, to see was to lose, to live was to owe. The fire that had once burned bright at Joel now dimmed to coals, and the people leaned close to it, listening to the wind press against the walls like the breath of the god himself. For them, wisdom was not comfort, but survival. Odin had taught them that even in darkness, the mind must stay awake, and that the price of understanding was never fully paid. When the lessons of Odin had been spoken, when the fires dwindled and only the hiss of snow remained, the people turned their thoughts to the groves. For though the gods were vast and unseen, they had places that were theirs, not built by hands but found. Far from the smoke of hearths and the noise of feasts, there were quiet clearings where the trees grew old and thick, their roots knotted like sleeping beasts. These were the Ve, the sacred spaces where sky and earth seemed to breathe together. No walls stood there, no bells or towers marked the boundary, only the feeling that the air within the grove was different, heavier, alive with waiting. Before there were temples or carved idols, there were such places. Nature itself was the first cathedral. In the sagas, the word Ve meant both holy place and sanctuary. It could be a stand of oaks, a ring of stones, a hill touched by mist. The holiness came not from human design, but from age, from stillness, from the quiet endurance of the landscape itself. The groves of the north were deep and cold, their trunks slick with moss, their branches heavy with ice. Even in daylight, they held a kind of twilight, a filtered dimness where sound behaved differently. A man could hear his own breath more clearly there, and the slow drip of melting snow felt like time moving through a smaller scale. It was in these groves that offerings were made to the unseen. Archaeological traces across Sweden, Denmark and Norway hint at such sites, places where animal bones lie buried beside broken weapons or clay vessels, where the soil holds fragments of amber and iron, as though left to feed something beneath the roots. These were not monuments of grandeur, but quiet gestures of recognition. The people believed that the trees themselves might be conduits to the divine, each trunk a column linking Midgard, the human world, to the higher realms above. The rituals that took place there were not meant to be heard beyond the grove. The sagas, and later Christian chroniclers, speak of sacrifices, blots, performed under the trees. Cattle and goats, sometimes horses, were offered to the gods. Their blood was sprinkled upon stones, upon the soil, upon the people themselves as a sign of renewal. Whether these acts were solemn or celebratory depended on the season, but always they were slow, deliberate, and filled with awe. The air after such rites would be still. Snow muffled every sound, even the breath of men, even the distant crack of ice. In that silence, the grove seemed to hold its own heartbeat. The Norse did not fill this quiet with chants or declarations. They listened, because in that waiting, something sacred stirred, the sense that their offerings had been received, that the old balance between man and God had been honored again. In some tales, the sacred groves were guarded. No one was allowed to harm an animal, or cut a branch within them. Landnámabók, the Icelandic Book of Settlements, tells that when new lands were claimed, men carried earth from their ancestral vey to the place where they would build their homes, so that the sanctity of the old land might follow them. It was not the grove itself, but the idea of it, the sacred silence, the pact between human and nature, that travelled across the sea. In the quiet of these groves, belief was not something spoken. It was felt as pressure in the air, as a stillness that bordered on the divine. The people did not kneel or cry out. They simply stood in the snow, their breath rising in slow clouds, and let the silence speak for them. For the gods, they believed, preferred dignity to desperation. Adam of Bremen, writing in the 11th century, described such a grove at Uppsala, a place where the trees were said to drip perpetually with offerings. He called it a terrible and beautiful sight, though his words were filtered through the eyes of a foreign faith. Modern historians read his account as both observation and metaphor, perhaps an exaggeration, perhaps not, but even stripped of myth, the image endures: tall trees heavy with snow, their branches gleaming in pale light, the ground below layered with the remnants of ceremony. The groves existed at the edge of things, not quite wilderness, not quite settlement. To enter one was to cross a threshold. The Norse called such boundaries verbond, sacred limits. To cross them lightly was dangerous. A grove might accept an offering, but it could just as easily keep it. Stories tell of travelers who took wood from sacred trees and were haunted by misfortune, of men who built too close and found their cattle ill. Whether these tales were moral lessons or memories of superstition hardly matters. They reflected a truth the people knew instinctively, that the land was not theirs to command. It was to be shared, respected, and occasionally feared. During midwinter, when the darkness was deepest, and the fires back at the homestead were burning low, some still went to the groves. Alone or in small groups, they carried torches and mead, murmuring prayers that were more like promises. They would pour the drink at the base of the oldest tree, whispering the names of gods and ancestors alike. The mead steamed faintly on the snow before vanishing into the frozen soil. No temple could have felt more intimate. There were no idols to stare back at them, no priestly voices echoing from walls. Only the groaning of trees, the weight of stars through branches, the smell of pine resin and blood and smoke, and somewhere beyond human hearing perhaps, the faint sigh of a world that accepted their offerings. The sacred groves were never fully abandoned. Even after Christianity took hold, and churches were built where the Vey once stood, villagers still avoided cutting the oldest trees. They still left small coins or bread near certain roots. Old habits persisted quietly, as if the memory of those nights, the snow, the torches, the slow rhythm of offering, was something that could not die, only sleep beneath the surface of belief. In the deep calm of the grove, where sound fell away and all that remained was breath, the people felt closest to their gods. The trees did not speak, yet they listened, and perhaps that was the point. For the divine to them was not always something that spoke back. It was something that waited, endlessly patient, beneath bark and ice. And in that stillness, in that great unbroken quiet, faith survived the winter. When the snow quieted, and the torches faded from the groves, the Norse turned their thoughts to the ones who had gone before, for in their world, death was not a vanishing. It was a crossing, a movement from one place to another, through doors that the living could not see, but could sometimes still feel. The people of the Old North did not imagine a single afterlife, nor a simple division between heaven and hell. Their gods ruled many worlds, and the dead went where their lives and their deaths had earned them. Some to Valhalla, Odin's hall, where warriors feasted eternally until Ragnarok. Some to Folkvanger, Freyja's field, where the fallen shared half the battle's harvest with the goddess of love and death. Some to Helheim, the cold, shadowed realm beneath the roots of the world tree, where the quiet dead lingered, neither punished nor praised, simply existing beyond warmth and time. But these were not distant places, unreachable and abstract. They brushed against the living world. The Norse believed that the boundaries between life and death were porous, that the dead could walk through dreams or stir in their graves when the night was long and the air turned thick with frost. The earth was full of thresholds, and the dead were never far. Across Scandinavia, burial mounds dotted the land, low, rounded shapes in the snow, like the backs of sleeping beasts. Inside them, the dead were laid with care. Weapons, combs, beads, food, and sometimes entire ships surrounded their bodies. These were not symbols but provisions, meant to help them on the journey ahead. Archaeologists have found graves where sleds, dogs, horses, and even hawks were buried beside their masters, bound to serve them in the next world. The living believed that everything one loved or relied upon in life must be mirrored in death, so that the transition might be smooth, respectful, and complete. The ship burial was the grandest of all, the vessel as a bridge between worlds. The dead were placed within its wooden ribs, surrounded by offerings, and sometimes burned as the flames lifted them toward the sky. Others were buried whole, the ship entombed beneath earth and stone, its prow forever pointing toward the horizon. Excavations at Oseberg and Gokstad in Norway reveal the precision and reverence of these rites. Carved prows, woven tapestries, the bones of animals, the faint lingering trace of incense. These were not simply graves, they were homes, waiting rooms for eternity. Yet, even with such ceremony, the Norse did not believe death to be entirely restful. There were tales, half feared, half revered, of those who stirred beneath their mounds. The Draga, the restless dead, were said to walk again, heavy and cold, wrapped in the same shrouds they were buried with. Some claimed to have heard the sound of soil shifting, or to have seen faint lights flickering atop ancient barrows on winter nights. It was not always malice that drove these revenants. Sometimes it was duty, or unfinished bonds, or the call of the gods who used the dead as messengers. The sagas are careful when they speak of such things. In Gretti's saga, the hero faces a draga, a corpse ghost named Glamour, who walks in moonlight, filled with dreadful strength. Glamour's curse lingers not as a horror story, but as a reflection of belief that death could not always contain the will of a powerful spirit. The dead, like the gods, were not wholly separate from the world of men. They could watch, protect, or haunt, depending on how they were remembered. To guard against this, the Norse practiced a deep reverence for ancestors. Offerings of food, mead, and small trinkets were left at the edges of mounds, especially during the Dissablot, the winter feast honoring the female spirits of kinship and fate, the Disir. These ancestral figures were thought to walk softly through the snow, unseen but attentive, blessing those who remembered them. The Landmabok tells of settlers in Iceland who chose their land near ancestral mounds, so that their kin might watch over the fields. The dead, if treated with care, were not a threat. They were part of the household, only sleeping beneath another kind of roof. In the deep of night, when the wind moved strangely, and the world felt thin, some claimed they could hear them. The soft creak of timbers in ship graves, or the faint sound of hooves, where horses had been buried long ago. The gods, they said, sometimes spoke through such echoes. A whisper on the air might carry not the voice of a man, but of something older, remembering its own past through the breath of the living. There was no fear in this belief, only caution. The Norse understood that the world was layered, the living above, the dead below, and between them a trembling veil that was strongest in light and weakest in dark. That was why winter nights felt heavier. That was why, during Yule, when the days were shortest, the dead were closest. Families kept a place open at the feast, an empty chair, a bowl left untouched, in case a spirit came to share their fire. Even the gods were not immune to this mingling. Odin himself was called Valfa, the father of the slain, because he gathered the souls of warriors to his hall. In doing so, he blurred the line between life and death. To die in battle was to be chosen, to live again in eternal struggle and feast. But those who died quietly through age or illness were not abandoned. They went to Hell's domain, a realm of rest and shadow, ruled not by cruelty but by the goddess Hel, whose half-pale, half-dark face mirrored the balance of all things. To the Norse mind, this duality was sacred. Death and life were not opposites. They were continuations. The hidden faces of the dead were not to be feared, but to be known, if only in silence. When a child was born, elders sometimes gave it the name of an ancestor, believing that a piece of that spirit returned. The dead then were never gone. They only changed form, trading breath for memory. And so the people lived beside their dead. They ploughed fields over old graves, built homes within sight of barrows, and told stories that began not with birth but with return. To them the gods ruled not a single heaven, but a cycle, the endless turning of life through light, darkness, and back again. When snow fell softly on the mounds and all the torches were out, it was said that the gods walked among their chosen, unseen perhaps, but never absent. The dead listened, the living waited, and somewhere in between the divine murmured through the soil. The night was never silent, it only spoke in slower tones. When the ground froze too hard to till, and the nights grew endless even at noon, the people of the north turned their gaze outward, toward the sea. It was always there, just beyond the last hill, breathing with a rhythm older than language. To live in Scandinavia was to live beside water, fjords cutting through mountains, rivers frozen like veins of glass, coastlines tangled with mist. The sea surrounded and defined them, as constant and unpredictable as the gods themselves. To the Vikings, the sea was not a barrier. It was the great road, the endless path between worlds, but it was also the most dangerous ally one could have. A creature of shifting tempers, its surface could glitter with peace in the morning, and turn black with fury by dusk. It fed them, carried them, tested them, and sometimes swallowed them whole. No man crossed it without offering something first. Before voyages, the rituals were quiet but deliberate. A small cup of ale poured into the surf, a coin cast from the prow, the blood of a bird or sheep spilled into the waves, so that Nord, god of the sea and father of calm waters, might grant them safe passage. Some captains whispered his name before every departure. Norda, the tamer of winds, the bringer of wealth, the one who could still the storm with a thought. Njord was unlike many of the gods men feared. He was not cruel, only precise. He gave favor to those who remembered him, and took from those who forgot. In the sagas, he was described as a god of peace and prosperity, but the sailors knew that his peace was conditional. Forget his offering, and the sea would rise with hunger. It was said that when a ship went missing and no wreck was ever found, it was because Njord had accepted it as his due, an entire crew taken in exchange for all those he had spared before. The sea itself carried his voice. It groaned and sighed and thundered, not randomly, but rhythmically, as though a will moved beneath it. Standing on a frozen shore, one could hear that voice in the long crash of waves. It was not a voice of comfort or command, but of memory, the sound of ages folding into one another. The Vikings understood this instinctively. Their mythology placed the sea not as an element, but as a living presence. In the Prose Edda, the world itself was born from the mingling of ice and fire, and the oceans were the blood of Ymir, the first giant. Thus every voyage was, in a sense, a passage over the body of a god. Every storm was not mere weather, but divine reminder. When a man drowned, he was not lost, he was claimed. Archaeology confirms how deeply this reverence ran. In ship burials along the Norwegian coast, vessels were sometimes placed on high ground facing the sea, as if waiting to return to it. The dead were surrounded by anchors, oars, and small offerings of salt or fish bones, reminders that even in death, the ocean might yet call them back. Some graves contained stones arranged in the shape of ships, though no timber remained. These stone ships, found across Sweden and Denmark, were symbolic vessels for souls. They faced the horizon, pointing to eternity. In daily life too, the sea governed thought and custom. Fishermen refused to speak certain words before dawn. Women mended nets in silence, believing that idle talk might draw envy from unseen watchers beneath the waves. Children were warned never to mock the sea's calmness, for calmness was its trick, the moment before it remembered its strength. The gods of the ocean were many. Njord ruled the coasts and harbours. Aegir and Ran, older and more capricious, reigned in the deeps. Aegir brewed ale for the gods and stirred the waves with his cauldron. Ran spread her net to capture the drowned. To the sailors, these myths were less poetry than warning. They said Ran's net could catch even the bravest man, if he sailed without sacrifice. So when storms began to mount, coins and food were cast overboard, small gestures to satisfy her hunger. In the quiet that followed, it was whispered that Ran had accepted the trade. The sea shaped the Viking soul as much as the cold or the sword. It demanded endurance, patience and surrender, the same virtues the gods prized. The longships that rode its surface were not merely tools of war or trade, but spiritual extensions of their makers. Their carved dragon prows were both decoration and defense, meant to frighten away spirits that lingered over the waves. The sound of oars in rhythm, the creak of timber, the hiss of spray, these were hymns, prayers spoken not to heaven but to the deep. To watch the sea at night was to face the divine directly. The horizon disappeared. The stars reflected on black water looked like portals to other worlds. A man alone on the deck could not tell where the sky ended or the ocean began, only that he was between them, suspended in the god's domain. It was here that many Vikings felt closest to Odin, not in battle but in solitude. The wind on their faces, the endless dark, the sense of being a single flicker in a vast, indifferent world. This was what it meant to be alive under their gods. There are accounts, faint and half-remembered, of sailors who heard voices on calm seas. Some said they heard their ancestors calling, others claimed the waves whispered prophecies, though never in words that could be understood. The sound was enough, the deep, rhythmic exhale of water meeting rock, the ceaseless motion that lulled and frightened in equal measure. For those who listened long enough, the sea did not simply speak, it answered. Even now, centuries later, standing on the same shores, one can sense it, the same cold wind, the same grey water, the same illusion of stillness hiding motion. The Norsemen are gone, their ships buried, their rituals swallowed by time, but the sea remains, unchanged in its moods. When the wind rises suddenly, when the tide roars against the rocks, it feels less like nature and more like memory, a presence that still demands acknowledgement. The Vikings understood something we have mostly forgotten, that the sea, like the gods, does not need belief to exist. It only needs silence and time. It was both their road and their reckoning, and in its endless movement, they saw eternity. When the last prayer was whispered into the waves and the ship slipped into fog, it was said that Njord listened. Whether he granted calm or called the storm was never truly in question. The sea, after all, had already made its decision. When the sea quieted and the longships rested against their moorings, when the men who had called to Njord returned with salt in their beards and silence in their eyes, the night belonged once more to the land, and to Freyja. She was not a goddess of gentle love as later ages imagined, nor a mere figure of romance. Freyja was vast, as complex and unyielding as the land itself. She ruled over beauty and passion, yes, but also over death, battle, and the strange serenity found in surrender. To worship her was to understand that what blooms must one day fall, and that desire and decay are only different faces of the same truth. In the sagas and the Prose Edda, she appears radiant and terrible, the daughter of Njord, sister of Freya, mistress of the falcon cloak that allowed her to fly between worlds. Her hall Sessrumnir stood in Folkvang, the field of the host, where half the slain of battle went to rest. The other half went to Odin, But it was said that Freyja chose first, taking those she favored before the Allfather could claim them. Her dominion over life and death was quiet, intimate, and deeply human. She cared not for glory but for closeness. The people of the Old North understood her not through temples or sermons, but through the rhythms of their own bodies and the cycles of the earth. She was the blush of dawn after the longest night, the pull of tide and blood, the fertility of soil and woman alike. In fields dark with frost, women whispered her name for fruitfulness. In childbirth, they begged her to stay near, to keep the soul tethered to the body. Yet Freyja's favor came at a cost, as all divine favor did. She demanded devotion not of fear, but of surrender. Those who called to her did so, knowing she might answer with passion or with loss. For love to her was never safe. Her symbols were those of paradox. Cats, both domestic and wild, pulled her chariot, creatures graceful and distant, capable of affection and sudden claw. The falcon cloak, woven from feathers that shimmered silver in moonlight, allowed her to traverse all the realms, the world of gods, of men, and of the dead. And then there was Brisingamen, her necklace, forged by dwarves, bought not with coin, but with the goddess's own surrender. Its brilliance was said to rival the northern lights themselves, but its price was whispered about in the same breath, the reminder that beauty and sacrifice were bound together. When the moon rose over the fords, and the world fell into the muted blue of night, people felt Freyja most keenly. The moon was her mirror, soft light over dark earth, revealing without revealing. In small homes, women left milk and honey near the threshold, small tokens to please her. The goddess of abundance might bless the livestock, the fields, or the womb, or she might pass in silence, her attention turned elsewhere. Either way, the act of offering mattered more than the reward. Men, too, called to her, not in battle, but in the quiet after. Warriors prayed for her mercy, when the blood cooled, and the dead lay still. For Freyja's half of the slain did not march forever. They rested, feasted, perhaps dreamed. In her realm, there was no endless war, only the gentle, perpetual twilight of remembrance. To die under her gaze was to be loved and known completely, a death not of pain, but of peace. The sagas tell little of her wrath, but they hint at it. Storms that ruined harvests, loves turned to obsession, longing that drove men to ruin. Freyja did not punish, she revealed. She showed mortals the full reach of what they asked for. Those who prayed for love found themselves consumed. Those who prayed for beauty grew vain and hollow. Those who prayed for wealth sometimes found it, and in finding it, discovered what it cost to keep. Her gifts, like her nature, were double-edged, sweet on the tongue, bitter in the bone. Her connection to death was not dark, but inevitable. The Vikings saw no contradiction in a goddess who ruled both desire and decay. To them these were not opposites, but continuations, each the shadow of the other. The same fire that gave life could burn it away. The same passion that joined lovers could undo them. In Freyja they saw the unity of all endings and beginnings. There were nights when the veil between worlds grew thin, when mist rolled over the fields, and the moon seemed to hang closer to the earth. On such nights, offerings were made quietly, a lock of hair, a drop of blood, a handful of flowers frozen in snow. The people said she walked among them then, her cloak rustling like wings, her cat silent at her feet. Some swore they smelled her presence, the faint perfume of wild flowers and ash. Others only felt it, a pressure in the air, a weight that was not heavy but consuming, as if love itself had a body, and had stopped to watch. Her stories travelled far, even beyond the north. In later centuries, her image blurred into other goddesses, Frigg, Venus, even Mary, each one inheriting some fragment of her quiet dominion. But none carried her exact balance, the beauty that promised comfort, and the sorrow that always followed. To worship Freyja beneath the moon was to accept impermanence. The Vikings, who knew well the fragility of life, understood that no field stays green forever, and no heart stays unbroken. Yet to love, to hope, to desire, even knowing the end, was an act of faith. In that sense, Freyja was the most human of the gods. When the night deepened, and the wind moved softly over the snow, Women whispered her name into the stillness, and men touched their amulets before sleep. The moon watched, pale and patient, as if listening. Somewhere, between one heartbeat and the next, the goddess might have answered, not with words, but with the quiet knowing that even loss was sacred. And so the people dreamed beneath her light, of lovers gone, of fields waiting for spring, of beauty that could not last, and therefore mattered all the more. When the wind rose, and the world turned white with snow, the people of the north listened for a sound deeper than storm. Beneath the howl of the blizzard, they said, came the rolling fury of Thor. His anger shook the heavens, a god's war echoing through cloud and ice. Thor was the defender of Midgard, the realm of men, and no god was more loved, or more feared. While Odin ruled with wisdom and secrets, Thor ruled with strength and certainty. He was the red-bearded protector, the hammer-bearer, the friend of farmers and warriors alike. But even the faithful knew that his protection was not gentle. It came with thunder and fire, and the reminder that the world was never safe for long. When thunder rolled in winter, it was said that Thor was riding across the storm, his chariot pulled by two massive goats, Tangrisnir and Tangjost, their hooves striking sparks against the clouds. Lightning was the flare of Mjolnir, his hammer, shattering the frost giants who crept too close to the world of men. To see that light was to glimpse the boundary between safety and destruction. On nights when the storms grew too fierce, families gathered around the hearth and burned oak logs, Thor's sacred wood. They offered roasted meat and ale, murmuring his name, so he would strike his enemies, not their homes. Children were told not to fear the thunder, it was their protector's roar. Yet even in comfort, a quiet awe held them, for to call upon Thor was to stand near a power that could not be tamed. His myths carried the pulse of the land itself. He was not a distant god, but one who fought every day for the world's survival. In the Eddas, Thor battles the giants, not out of hate, but duty. The giants are not evil. They are the chaos of nature, the endless cold, the hunger in the dark. Thor stands between that chaos and the fragile warmth of humankind. Each thunderstorm was his reminder that order must be won again and again. It was said that when he threw Mjolnir, mountains cracked and seas rose. Yet the same hammer blessed marriages and fields. Farmers traced its shape over their plows. Sailors carved its symbol into their ships. Mjolnir was both destruction and renewal, the force that broke what was dead so new life could begin. Even his goats spoke of the strange cycle of his divinity. After long journeys, Thor would slay them for food, then lay their bones in the hide, blessing them with his hammer, so they rose whole again by dawn. Death and rebirth, hunger and plenty, all within his grasp. To follow Thor was to understand that strength was never cruelty, but endurance. There were winters so hard that even Thor seemed far away. The storms would howl for days, the sky thick with ash-colored clouds. In those times the people said the god was fighting longer battles. The giants had grown bold, and the thunder that split the night was the sound of his rage. Still they burned oak and poured ale into the snow, trusting he would hear, because Thor's anger, though terrible, was never mindless. His fury was the fury of protection, the fire that guards the hearth, the storm that drives away worse storms. The people saw in him not wrath, but will, the will to keep the world turning despite the cold. When the thunder finally faded, and the air stilled, silence felt holy. The people stepped outside, and saw the sky clear, washed by lightning. To them that was his promise fulfilled, that no matter how long the night, the storm would break, and the light would return. And so they remembered. To worship Thor was not to ask for peace, but for the strength to survive the storm. In the dim seasons when days dwindled to a faint grey and night pressed for months without mercy, there came the time of blot. The word meant to strengthen, or to worship, but to those who gathered beneath the cold air, it meant an exchange, the steady rhythmic giving of life, back to the powers that sustained it. Nothing in the north was taken for granted, not a birth, not a harvest, not a Thor. Every gift demanded another in return. and so people learned to speak in the oldest language they knew, the language of blood and smoke. The place was seldom a temple, at least not in the early centuries. A vey, a sacred enclosure, or a clearing bordered by birch and pine would do. Stones were set in a circle, the snow cleared, the torches fixed upright so that their flames leaned together like bowed heads. The air smelled of resin, frost and anticipation. Families came from scattered farms along frozen ridges, trudging through drifts with sledges loaded with grain, beer, and animals chosen for the rite. Some carried carved wooden idols of their gods, others trusted that the gods needed no faces, only presence. When the people arrived, they greeted the grove as if it were alive. The earth itself, they believed, remembered each offering. The Gothi, the priest or chieftain, stood in the center, a bowl of ale in one hand, and a sprig of evergreen in the other. He called upon the gods in measured phrases, words learned by repetition rather than revelation. The speech rose, then fell into the hush that always followed, a hush so deep that even the horses seemed to listen. Then came the giving. The chosen animals, often oxen, goats or pigs, were led into the circle. The Gothi made the sign of Mjolnir above them, invoking Thor, or lifted the bowl of ale toward Odin, or toward the unseen Vanir, who governed fertility and the weather. When the blade met the throat, the sound was muffled by snow, and the warm breath of the beast joined the winter air. The blood was caught in bowls and sprinkled over idols, stones, and the people themselves with the evergreen branch. The crimson spray on white snow marked the boundary between worlds, the visible and the divine. To modern eyes it might seem cruel, but to those who stood there, it was covenant, not cruelty. Life fed life, the gods received strength so that they might return it. The blood was not born of abundance, but of anxiety. The people feared that if they stopped, the cycle would break, the sun would falter, the crops would fail, the sea would swallow their ships. Sacrifice was not an act of violence, but of reassurance. After the offering, the carcasses were cleaned and cooked. The blood ended not in mourning, but in feasting. The same blood that consecrated the grove seasoned the broth simmering in iron pots. This shared meal was sacred. Gods, ancestors, and humans partook together, though only one side could be seen. The ale was passed, and when it touched the lips of each participant, they toasted in a specific order, first to Odin, for victory and wisdom, then to Njord and Freya, for good harvests, and finally to the memory of kin who had gone before. The toasts were slow, deliberate, and sometimes tearful. They believed that the steam rising from their food carried the essence of the feast upward, a fragrant echo of their devotion. In places like Uppsala, where Adam of Bremen wrote of golden idols and grand processions, the blood may have reached its most elaborate form. He claimed that every 9th year, nobles and commoners alike brought animals and perhaps captives to hang in the grove, their bodies a grim garland for the gods, yet modern scholars read his account with caution. He never saw it himself, and Christian chroniclers often exaggerated pagan rites to emphasize contrast with their own faith. Archaeology at Gamla Uppsala has revealed animal bones, yes, but few signs of human remains. The truth may lie between reverence and rumor, the memory of a people who offered deeply, and the outsiders who misunderstood that depth as savagery. Farther west in Iceland and Norway, the blood adapted to smaller communities. Each farmstead held its own ceremonies, guided by local Gotha. Their offerings could be simple, a bowl of milk left by the hearth for the household spirits, or a few drops of ale poured into the soil before ploughing. The intent was the same, acknowledgement of dependence on forces beyond comprehension. Smoke was the bridge. It rose through the branches, twisting against the low clouds until the wind carried it away. In that smoke lived prayer, not in words but in essence. It mingled with breath, with the smell of pine and fat, with the faint metallic tang of blood on the snow. Those who stood in its path closed their eyes, and felt it settle on their faces like a benediction. They had no expectation of reply. It was enough that the air moved, that the world continued to breathe back. As night deepened, torches burned low. The Gothi poured the last of the ale onto the ground, whispering a final thanks. In the flickering orange light, The grove seemed to inhale and exhale. The people lingered, reluctant to break the stillness. When they finally turned for home, they walked silently through the drifts, their boots crunching in rhythm with the pulse of the earth beneath. Behind them, the embers dimmed, and the snow began to cover the traces of what had been given. The language of blood and smoke needed no translation. It was as old as the wind, older than speech itself. It told of trust maintained through fear, of gratitude shaped by survival. And when the first faint grey of morning brushed the horizon, those who had taken part knew that for another day at least, the balance held. When the fires of the blot burned low and the night began to pale at its edges, a different kind of silence took hold. It was the silence of the Gotha, the priests and chieftains of the north who lingered after the others had gone. They waited not for applause, nor for revelation, but for the slow return of light. Their duty was not to speak of the gods, but to speak to them, and that, they believed, required patience. The Gothi was not a priest in the way later centuries would know the word. He was not cloaked in scripture or sanctified by church. He was a man of lineage, a farmer, a landowner, a leader of men who also led the gods' rites because his ancestors had done so before him. In the sagas, his title appears beside his name as a mark of authority, as natural as land inheritance. The people respected him, not because he claimed to know divine truth, but because he carried the memory of its performance. His power came from repetition, the slow, careful imitation of gestures handed down through generations. Every blot, every oath, every feast had its prescribed pattern: the raising of the horn, the sprinkling of the blood, the invocation of names. These acts were not creative, they were remembered. To stray from the old ways risked silence from the gods. The Gothi's strength lay in remembering what others forgot. At dawn, when the last torch guttered out, he would gather the bowls and clean the stones, his breath rising in pale clouds. He was a caretaker more than a preacher, tending to the delicate line between worlds. The gods required constancy, they were not bound to words, only to observance. In Iceland, the Gotha formed the backbone of society. There was no king there, no great temple to unify the people. Instead, each district had its Gothi, who held both political and spiritual weight. The Althing, Iceland's great assembly, was filled with such men, part judge, part priest, part farmer. They presided over law disputes by day, and over rituals by night, their dual authority binding community and cosmos together. When Snorri Sturluson later wrote of them in the Heimskringla and Edda, he described a world where faith and governance were the same thing. The gods did not rule from the heavens, they were mirrored in human order. A Gothi, who failed in leadership, might lose divine favor, and thus the faith of his followers. Power, in this world, was not abstract. It was an inheritance of gestures and tone, of how one lifted a horn or pronounced an oath beneath the stars. The Gotha did not sermonize. There were no written laws of morality, no eternal punishments promised, no redemption offered. Their rituals were transactions, a careful maintaining of balance. When they spoke to the gods, their words were rhythmic and practical, a cadence that sounded more like incantation than prayer. The sagas say they chanted old words, but those words were not preserved. They belonged to the night, and to the breath that uttered them. Those who stood nearby might have heard the Gothi's voice as a low hum, almost lost in the wind. He would repeat the invocations, pausing to listen for the subtle changes in the fire's crackle or the shifting of the trees. The response was never a voice, never a vision, but a feeling, the heavy, grounding stillness that meant the gods had heard. Sometimes, when the ceremonies were large, other men joined him in the performance. They carried Hullult Bolli, the sacrificial bowls, and Hullultin, the twigs used to sprinkle blood. They watched carefully, ensuring every motion was correct. Even a missed gesture could be considered dangerous. For in these rites, precision was faith, to repeat was to believe. The Gothi's knowledge was not written down but lived. He learned it by standing beside his father, by watching the way the fire was built, the way offerings were laid, the timing between chant and silence. Each detail mattered. When to pour ale, when to bow, when to pause. By performing these acts year after year, generation after generation, he kept alive not just the gods but the memory of the people themselves. And so, when the last of the participants had drifted away, leaving only the priest and the coals, he would wait. The horizon in the north took hours to brighten, the sky moved from black to deep blue to a grey that promised day, but seldom delivered it. The Gothi stayed until that faint grey appeared. It was not written anywhere that he must. It was simply what had always been done. As he waited, he might press his palm into the frozen ground, feeling its firmness beneath the thin layer of snow. He might speak softly the names of those who had stood there before him, fathers, uncles, ancestors whose bones fed the same soil. In that act of remembering, he fulfilled his truest function, not mediator, but continuance. In later centuries, when Christianity reached the north, these same men were among the first to adapt. Some became local priests under the new faith, their authority too deeply rooted to be easily removed. The gestures changed. The cross replaced the hammer. The psalm replaced the chant, but the rhythm endured. The Gotha had always been custodians of rhythm. And yet, in the quiet of dawn, it is said that some still kept the old vigil in secret. They would rise before light, step outside their wooden halls, and breathe into the cold air. For a moment, they would hear the creak of ice on the roof, the sigh of the wind through the trees, and feel again the nearness of gods that demanded no scripture, only attention. To wait for morning was an act of devotion, a reminder that even the longest night ended, and that faith, like dawn, came not in revelation but in slow return. The Gothi's patience was his prayer. The light came late, but it always came. The sun came back so faintly that at first no one was sure they saw it. It began as a dull shimmer at the farthest edge of the world, a pale breath against the horizon that could have been imagination. After months of darkness, the eye mistrusted brightness. Yet, as the day wore on, the faint light held. It did not warm the air, but it was enough to reveal the contours of the land again. The ridges, the frozen fields, the long white river that glimmered like a blade beneath the snow. That was the sign they had been waiting for. The turning of the sun. It was Jol, the winter solstice, the quiet hinge of the year when time itself seemed to pause. In the north, where winter could feel endless, the people marked this return with ritual patience. They did not greet the light with wild celebration. Joy in such a place was always cautious. To laugh too loudly might draw the gods' envy, or worse, their notice. The fires that night were different from those of sacrifice. They were not meant to please but to reminders that the world still turned, that the sky still obeyed its own slow rhythm. Families gathered around long hearths, the flames reflecting in bowls of ale, and in the dull gleam of iron utensils. The air inside was thick with smoke, stew, and the sharp sweetness of mead. Outside, frost crackled on the wooden walls, and the faint wind moved like a living thing through the gaps of the roofs. They did not speak of warmth, for warmth was not yet promised. The returning sun was a guest who might leave again, so they feasted carefully. The Jol Ablaw, the Yule offering, was both celebration and insurance. The first portion of meat was always set aside for the gods, laid gently on a wooden dish near the fire. Ale was poured on the ground in quiet toasts, the liquid hissing as it met the embers. Each toast was a memory to Thor, who kept the storms from breaking their homes, to Freya, who would soon wake the soil again, to the ancestors whose bones waited in the frozen earth for spring. The Yule season lasted many days, 12, some said, and its customs reached deep into what would later become Christmas. Evergreen branches were hung indoors, not for decoration but protection. The trees stayed green when everything else died, and so they were seen as symbols of endurance. Candles or small fires were lit in windows to guide wandering spirits, a flickering message to both ancestors and unseen watchers that their descendants still remembered. In old Icelandic and Norse accounts, Jol was as much about continuity as hope. It marked not a beginning but a survival, proof that the darkest nights had passed without the world ending. In Heimskringla, Snorri Sturluson described King Haakon the Good's attempt to merge the pagan Yule with the Christian celebration of Christ's birth. But long before that blending, Yule had been older than any faith, a time to honor the turning of the wheel, the fragile return of light that had not yet learned to stay. There were still dangers in that light. The stories told that during Yule, the wild hunt rode, Odin himself leading a host of restless spirits through the sky, searching for souls and omens. The people barred their doors and placed offerings outside, hoping the hunt would pass them by. Inside, they spoke in low tones, as if the air itself might be listening. Even celebration required restraint. The gods were awake again, and the boundary between mortal and divine thinned like ice underfoot. Children watched the hearth, where their mothers stirred the stew and told half-whispered tales of the last great winter. Fimbulfete, the terrible season that would one day precede Ragnarok. But not yet, they said. Not this year. The faint circle of sun that hovered just above the horizon was proof enough that the end had been delayed once more. As the night deepened, the people began the Yule Vigil, a tradition older than memory. Some stayed awake until the first full dawn of the returning light, believing that sleep would invite misfortune. Fires were kept burning throughout the long hours, their glow rising and falling like breath. Outside, the world remained silent except for the creaking of trees and the occasional cry of a raven. The Gotha, the priests who had led the sacrifices earlier in winter, walked among the fires. They said little. Their role now was not to invoke but to witness, to ensure that the covenant had been honored, and that the gods in their inscrutable way had accepted. They waited until the first sliver of orange appeared behind the mountains. When it came, it was brief, the light touching the snow just long enough to draw faint color from it. Men and women stepped outside, their breath rising in silver threads, and faced the horizon. No one cheered, they only nodded once quietly, as though confirming a promise. The gods had kept their end of the bargain. Now men must keep theirs. Inside the halls, the fire was stirred one last time before the day began. The ashes were scattered carefully, mixed with ale, and spread along the thresholds, a blessing against the lingering dark. The smell of smoke clung to everything, hair, cloth, and the wooden beams overhead. It was not unpleasant. It was the scent of continuity, of the fragile comfort that kept them through another year. By midday, the faint light had retreated again. Winter was far from over, but the people had seen enough to believe that the world still turned. The gods had been fed, the rites performed, the covenants remembered, and for that brief day, the north exhaled. When darkness returned, it felt softer. The sky, though black, seemed less oppressive, as if it too had taken part in the ritual of renewal. Inside their homes, the people spoke a little more freely, their laughter small and restrained but real. They knew that light would return again, not soon, but surely. And so the night of the returning sun passed into memory, one more mark in the slow wheel of seasons. The gods had listened, the people had endured, and in the long quiet after, as the fires faded and the wind moved gently through the snow, it was said that the world itself sighed, not in relief, but in recognition. When the sun returned, and winter's grip began to loosen, the people of the north turned their thoughts from survival to memory. The gods had been fed, the fires kept alive, and the light had returned once more. But what the gods gave, men feared to forget, and so they began to carve. Across the cold lands of Scandinavia, from the deep fjords of Norway to the open plains of Sweden, the people raised stones, vast grey slabs pulled from the earth, shaped by frost and hand. They were not temples, they were messages. Each one stood like a sentry against time itself, inscribed with runes, the strange sharp letters that held not only words but power. The runes were not merely marks, they were believed to live. Each line and curve was a spell in itself, a fragment of the divine language Odin had won when he hung from Yggdrasil, the world tree, for 9 nights, pierced by his own spear, thirsting, starving, waiting for the gift of sight. When at last he saw the runes, he did not learn them, he seized them, wrenching them from the void between worlds. That was why, the people said, each rune demanded respect. It was not written, it was awakened. The earliest of these stones, the rune stones, began appearing long before the age of Christian kings, in the 4th and 5th centuries, perhaps even earlier. By the Viking Age, around the 9th to 11th centuries, they stood everywhere, beside roads, near rivers, at the entrances to villages, and on lonely hillsides, where the wind never ceased to move. Some were plain, others grand and ringed with serpents, dragons, and interwoven knotwork. Most bore names, the names of the dead, a husband for his wife, a son for his father, a warrior for his fallen comrade. The words carved into the granite were often simple. Osmund raised this stone for Thorsten, his brother, a brave man. Gunvir raised this stone for her husband, who died in the east with the men of Ingvar. But beneath those simple words, there was always something more. Each carving was a vow, a declaration that the dead would not be lost to silence. The stones were more than memorials. They were bridges, connecting the mortal world to that of the divine. The people believed that as long as a name was spoken, as long as the runes remained, the soul endured, and so, the gods too were remembered. On some stones the old names still appeared. Thor, Odin, and Freyja, invoked not as distant gods but as witnesses. May Thor hallow these runes, one inscription declares. Another promises that the carving was made in memory and in faith to the old gods. Even when Christianity began to spread, the habit of carving runes remained. The cross might replace Thor's hammer, but the letters, the ancient shapes stayed the same. To carve a rune was to speak in silence. The carver, known as a runemather or rune master, would begin by tracing the shapes with charcoal or ash, whispering the sounds under his breath. The knife or chisel struck stone with steady rhythm, each blow echoing like a heartbeat in the cold air. It could take days, sometimes weeks, to finish a single inscription. The precision mattered. A single miscut line could change the meaning, or worse, offend the spirit being named. There was reverence in the act, but also danger. Runes could bless, but they could also curse. In the poetic Edda, Odin warns of the Malrunes, words of doom carved by those who wished harm. Some stones carried protection spells, meant to keep grave robbers away, or to ensure that the dead slept peacefully. Others contained warnings, cryptic words about vengeance or fate. One of the most famous rune stones, the Roke Stone of Sweden, stands as tall as a man and is covered in over 700 runes, the longest surviving runic inscription in the world. It speaks of kings, warriors, and the cycles of day and night, but it also hints at something older, prophecies, gods, and the struggle between light and dark. Scholars debate its meaning even now. Some say it is a memorial to a fallen sun, others, a coded myth, a lament for the fading of the old gods and the arrival of a new age. In every village, there was at least one stone. Some stood alone by water, reflections trembling in the ripples. Others were set in clusters, like small graveyards of memory. Over time, moss crept across the carvings, softening the edges, but never erasing the intent. Travelers would stop and run their hands over the grooves, feeling the ancient power within them. The stories said that on certain nights, the long nights, when the aurora danced and the wind moaned through the fjords, you could hear the runes whisper, not words exactly, but a feeling, remembrance, persistence, the echo of old prayers. Even centuries later, after the last pagan fires were quenched and crosses crowned the hills, the rune stones remained. The Christians did not destroy them. Some were left standing, others were built into church walls, perhaps to claim their power, or to bury it. In many old Scandinavian churches, if you look closely at the foundation stones, you can still see the faint scratches of runes beneath the mortar, names of gods hiding under the new god's house. To the people of the Viking Age, these stones were more than history. They were promises kept in stone, promises to remember, to endure, to outlast the wind and the snow, and somehow, they did. The gods they honored faded from worship, but their marks remained, carved into the bones of the land. Today, the runestones still stand. Tourists walk among them, taking pictures, reading translations on small plaques. Few understand what they're standing beside, not just relics of an old religion, but the physical embodiment of memory itself. The runes were meant to speak to gods who listened through time, and in a way they succeeded. Their voices travel through 1,000 years, whispering across the ages that faith once carved into stone never truly dies. And so, as winter faded, and the light slowly returned each year, the people of the north knew that even if the gods demanded silence, their names would not be lost to it. For every offering burned away, every prayer spoken into wind, there was always a stone, solid, waiting, remembering. By the time the runestones had begun to weather, a new sound drifted into the north, not thunder, not chant, but a low and foreign murmur. It came first with traders and captives, with the faint scent of incense and strange prayers. It was not the voice of Odin or Thor, nor the whisper of the vulva in her trance. It was a gentler sound, a promise murmured in Latin, Pax vobiscum, peace be with you. The Vikings, who had long believed that peace was merely the pause between storms, regarded this new god with suspicion. His priests spoke of forgiveness, of humility, of one death that was meant to redeem all others. To men who had built their world upon honor, vengeance and the balance of offering, this seemed both wondrous and impossible. Yet the word spread, not like conquest, but like wind, unseen, persistent, reshaping everything it touched. From the south, from England, from the Frankish lands and across the sea from Ireland, came the monks. They carried no swords, only books. Their clothing was dark and simple, their hair shaved in the odd circle of the tonsure. They built small wooden chapels on coasts and islands, often near places already considered sacred. They learned the tongue of the locals, spoke kindly, and offered bread and wine instead of blood and mead. They healed the sick, taught letters to chieftains' sons and sang when the sun went down. The first conversions were not victories, they were negotiations. A chieftain might allow a chapel to be built beside a pagan shrine, or let his wife be baptized while he continued to sacrifice to Thor before setting sail. In these northern lands, faith was never swift. The gods of the Vikings were not easily replaced. They had been born from the soil, the sea, and the cold itself. Still, the world was changing. Trade routes thickened. Silver from the east and silk from the south began to cross the harbors of Denmark and Sweden. With them came missionaries, envoys of kings, and the weight of new empires. The cross became a sign not only of belief, but of alliance. To accept the new god was, in time, to join the greater world, to receive peace with the Franks, safe passage with the Saxons. Yet among the old faithful, unease stirred. The blot fires burned less often. The sacred groves grew quiet. The Gotha, those priests of the old gods who once held both sacred and political power, found their influence dimming. Where once they presided over feasts and sacrifices, now bishops began to speak. The gods who demanded had met a god who forgave, but the change was not clean. In Iceland, where the sagas would one day be written, the conversion was a slow, deliberate choice. In the year 1000, the Althing, the Great Assembly, gathered to decide whether the island would be Christian or heathen. They chose both. The new faith was declared official, but men were allowed to worship in secret, so long as they kept their fires hidden. The old gods did not vanish in a single day. They slipped into the earth like embers. And still, even those who wore the cross dreamed of Odin. The sagas, written by Christian hands generations later, still spoke with reverence of the gods they no longer worshipped. Odin became a wanderer in the mists, Thor a memory of thunder, Frasier the shadow of desire. They lingered not as blasphemies, but as heritage. The poets, the skalds, who had once recited tales of Valhalla, now turned their craft to hymns and saints' lives. Yet even those new verses carried the rhythm of the old ones, long, slow, and echoing like footsteps in snow. In some places, the churches were built where temples had stood. At Uppsala, the great temple where sacrifices had once been made to Odin, Thor, and Freya, a Christian church rose in its place. The missionaries said it was a triumph, a cleansing of heathen ways, but to the locals, it was also continuity. The gods had changed their names, but the sacred ground remained. Even so, traces of the old faith persisted. Farmers still left offerings of grain or milk at the edges of their fields. Fishermen whispered short prayers to Njord before setting sail, just in case. When thunder cracked, mothers made the sign of the cross. but children still smiled and said, "Thor is riding." Old women tied red threads around their wrists to ward off spirits, calling them angels now, though their grandmothers would have called them elves. The wind of change never came all at once. It seeped into dreams. A Christian might wake from sleep feeling a weight upon his chest, and say it was a demon pressing down, but his grandfather would have known it as a draga, a restless dead thing from the old world. Fear survived, only its names shifted. Some of the most faithful Christians of the North carried both worlds inside them. King Olaf Tryggvason, who ruled Norway at the turn of the millennium, was baptized in England, and burned heathen shrines upon his return, yet he also claimed descent from Odin. To destroy the old gods entirely would have been to destroy one's own ancestry, and so, even among converts, the memory of the gods lived quietly, folded into the heart like an unspoken word. By the 12th century, the last great pagan sacrifices had ended, and the cross crowned the land. Yet the soil beneath the churches still held bones of animals, and sometimes of men, remnants of rituals older than written memory. Archaeologists would later find them, mixed with fragments of amber, tools and rings, offerings that no monk had ever blessed. The Christian wind that blew from the south did not extinguish the north. It reshaped it. The stories of sacrifice and fate were replaced with tales of redemption and grace, but both carried the same rhythm, the slow acceptance that life was brief, the world vast, and that some power beyond human reach shaped them both. In the quietest corners, where the forests met the sea, some still whispered the old names. They did not shout them. They breathed them softly, as if afraid to wake something that slept beneath the roots. And perhaps they were right, because faith, like winter, never truly dies. It waits beneath the Thor, hidden in the stones, ready to rise again when the nights grow long. Before the cross crowned the north, before the quiet wind of the new faith had fully settled, there stood a place where the old gods still received what they were owed. It was said that no temple in all of Scandinavia shone brighter, or smelled stronger than that of Uppsala, the sacred heart of Sweden. Here in the lowlands where rivers met, and the soil was dark with centuries of offerings, the gods were fed one last time. The temple itself was a marvel, built not of stone, but of wood, golden in color, and adorned with intricate carvings. Adam of Bremen, the 11th century chronicler, who recorded its existence, wrote that its walls glittered, all with gold, and that within it stood 3 mighty statues, Odin, Thor, and Freya, each larger than life, each reflecting one of the world's necessary powers. Odin in his armor, holding his spear, Thor in the center, red-bearded and radiant, grasping his hammer, and Freya, the god of fertility and harvest, with his unmistakable symbol of virility. Around them hung weapons and treasures, the gifts of kings and warriors long dead, their silver darkened by smoke and time. Outside stretched a grove, deep, ancient and silent. No axe was ever to cut its trees. Its ground was sacred and terrible, for it was there that the sacrifices were made. Every 9th year, according to the sagas and Adam's account, the people gathered from all the provinces of Sweden. For 9 days they feasted and worshipped, their prayers thick in the air like mist. Each day, offerings were given, 9 of every living thing, horses, dogs, cattle, and it was said, men. The number 9, holy to Odin, echoed through every ritual, representing the cycles of life, death and renewal. The bodies were hung from the branches of the trees, or laid at their roots. The air was filled with the smell of pine and blood, of smoke and mead, of iron and earth. The chroniclers called it barbaric, yet for those who lived it, the act was not cruelty. It was a covenant renewed, the balance between the mortal and the divine. The gods had created the world through sacrifice, Odin and his brothers killing the giant Ymir, to form the seas, the mountains and the sky, and so the world demanded sacrifice to remain whole. To stand in the grove was to feel the weight of that truth. The sound of chanting mingled with the rustle of leaves. The wind seemed to carry voices that were not human. The smoke from the altars drifted upward through the branches, curling into the pale sky like a bridge between worlds. In those moments, the people believed they were seen, that the gods were near enough to touch. It was not an act of madness. It was order. The farmers who gave their livestock, the warriors who offered captives, the priests who spilled the blood, all believed that without these offerings, the sun might not rise, the fields might fail, the seas might claim too many men. Their world depended on the rhythm of giving and taking, on the notion that life was a loan from the gods, and it must be repaid. Even Adam of Bremen, writing from the Christian world beyond the Baltic, could not entirely conceal a tone of awe. He described the temple as both splendid and dreadful, a place where faith was visible, tangible, where every scent, every shimmer of light seemed charged with meaning. He wrote of a vast tree growing beside the temple, its branches evergreen through winter, its roots reaching into a pool where sacrifices were drowned. When one of the faithful threw a man into the water, and he did not rise again, it was taken as a sign that the gods had accepted him. Archaeology, cautious but persistent, has sought this place. No temple structure has survived, for wood decays and gold can be stolen, but traces remain, post holes, fragments of idols, and soil darkened by centuries of organic remains. Near the modern cathedral of Uppsala, excavations have uncovered evidence of a great cultic center, bones of animals, burnt offerings and sacred deposits. These are faint whispers, but they align too closely with the old accounts to dismiss. The priests of Uppsala, the Gotha, were not men of sermons, they were keepers of memory. Their authority came from lineage, their duty from necessity. When they led the sacrifices, they did not plead or argue with their gods. They reenacted a truth as old as frost, that all life demands payment. They stood beneath the evergreen tree with steady hands, their faces calm, their words rhythmic and low. To the outside world, it was cruelty. To them it was maintenance of the world's fragile order. By the time the last great ceremony was held, the Christian kings had already begun to rise. Olaf of Norway, Ansgar the missionary, and others had brought the cross to many of the Norse lands. Yet Uppsala held out longer, a remnant of the old faith still blazing in the north. The temple became a symbol of resistance, not political, but spiritual. The people clung to it because it was familiar, because its gods spoke their language. But time has no mercy for gods. The festivals grew smaller. The emissaries of the new faith grew bolder. The gold that once covered the idols was stripped, melted down, repurposed for chalices and crosses. The tree was cut, or perhaps it fell on its own. The pool dried, its surface overgrown with grass, and where the temple had stood, a church was built, a tall cathedral of stone, where men knelt not before three gods but one. Even so, whispers lingered. For years, villagers claimed that in the deep of winter, when the sun barely rose and the snow muffled every sound, you could stand in the shadow of the church and hear faint creaking, as if branches were moving above you, heavy with unseen weight. Some said it was only the wind, others said the tree still lived beneath the soil, its roots clutching at old offerings, its sap dark as memory. In the chronicles, the last sacrifices dated vaguely. Some say the late 11th century, others earlier. No one knows the final moment when blood ceased to stain the ground of Uppsala. Perhaps it ended not in a single act, but in silence. One winter, no animals were brought, no chants rose into the air. The priests aged, the crowds dwindled, and the gods, long fed by faith and fire, were left to starve. And yet, Uppsala endures. Its modern cathedral stands high, its bells calling across the same land where once the hammer and spear were raised. Beneath it, the earth still holds what the gods once claimed, the bones of men and beasts, fragments of gold, and soil blackened by ancient smoke. The last sacrifice was not merely an ending, it was the turning of an age, the moment when one world exhaled its final breath, and another drew its first. The grove fell silent, but the silence was not peace, it was memory, long, patient, and waiting beneath the roots of time. There was no final battle, no great burning of temples, no thunderous farewell from the old gods. They did not die, as heroes die, in flame and song. They simply fell silent. It began slowly, like frost creeping across a field. After Uppsala's altars went cold, the priests who once tended them faded from memory. The last fires of the old faith dimmed in isolated valleys and distant fjords, where the wind still carried whispers of forgotten chants. The new faith, the one that promised peace instead of power, spread not through swords, but through steady patience. Churches rose where groves had stood, stone replaced wood, bread and wine replaced blood and smoke. And yet, silence is not the same as absence. In the far north, beyond the easy reach of kings and bishops, there were people who still turned their faces to the old ways, not in defiance, but in habit. When they sowed their seed, they still murmured a line their grandfathers had said, "May the earth remember." When they lit fires in winter, they still placed a small piece of bread beside it, for the house spirits. They no longer spoke Odin's name, but they still left room for him, a space in the corner of thought, a pause between breaths. The gods had been too deeply woven into the land to vanish entirely. They lingered not in shrines or temples, but in forests, in fog, in the slow thaw of spring. They became the hum beneath life. The superstition one does not confess aloud, but still follows. A nail driven into a beam to keep Thor's lightning away. A bow of the head to the first snow. A whisper to the sea before the nets were cast. It was the age of forgetting, but forgetting too is a kind of remembering. The monks who arrived to teach the new faith often found their congregations reluctant to abandon their customs. They baptized men who still carved runes. They blessed marriages where the bride wore a hammer hidden under her gown. In the corners of farms stood carved figures, worn smooth, unpainted, anonymous, no longer called idols, but old wood, kept for luck. The sagas tell of a time when even kings wavered. King Haakon the Good, raised in Christian England, tried to bring the new religion to Norway, but was forced to eat horseflesh at a pagan feast to appease his people. The tension was not merely between gods, but between generations. The old world did not die willingly, it was persuaded to sleep. In Iceland, where poets remembered longer than priests, the transition was almost gentle. The Althing, the Great Council, decided, after long debate, to adopt Christianity. But even then, they allowed men to worship the old gods in private, as long as no public sacrifice was made. It was a political peace. But beneath it, the old songs still breathed. The poets, the skalds, began to change their language. Where once they invoked Odin for wisdom, they now invoked Christ. But the structure of their verse remained the same, as if the rhythm itself had been carved by older hands. And so, the new stories were born upon the bones of the old. Archaeologists, digging in the quiet soil of Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, have found strange things from this time. Amulets shaped like Thor's hammer lying beside crosses, both worn smooth by the same neck. A farmer's grave containing both Christian runes and pagan symbols. It was not rebellion, it was uncertainty. A generation caught between faiths, afraid to anger either heaven or the earth below. Some say this was when the gods themselves began to fade, not because they were defeated, but because their names were forgotten. And yet, there are stories of strange dreams from that twilight, dreams of tall figures walking in snow, saying nothing, leaving only the faint smell of smoke. Shepherds, who claimed to hear chanting from beneath the frozen ground. Children who saw faces in the mist, watching from the tree line. It was said that the gods had retreated, not destroyed, but buried within the world they had shaped. The rivers, the mountains, the thunder, these became their bodies. They no longer spoke through priests, but through weather, chance and instinct. Oh! When a hunter offered a portion of his kill to the fire, even without knowing why, it was to them he offered. In this silence, something strange happened. Memory became myth, and myth became history. The poems of the Edda, once sacred, were now literature, stories of an age when gods still walked. Scholars copied them not as scripture, but as folklore, and so the gods survived their own extinction, as characters instead of deities, remembered by ink instead of blood. Still there were those who felt the loss. In the long northern winters, when snow buried the doorways and the world seemed asleep, some elders would sit by the fire and mutter, "Once the gods spoke." Their grandchildren would laugh, calling it nonsense, but the old ones would shake their heads, listening to the storm outside, and whisper, "That's him." That's Thor still walking. The silence was not absolute. Across generations, the old words shifted and hid within new ones. Christmas blended with Yule. Saints replaced land spirits. The festivals of sowing and harvest changed names, not meaning. The world turned, but the roots remained. The gods had only gone underground, beneath layers of prayer and time. In the centuries that followed, travelers from the south wrote of these lands as if they were tamed, converted, civilized. But beneath the surface, a deeper rhythm persisted, a quiet pulse of the old faith, soft but steady. The North remembered in its own way, through its weather, its poetry, and its silence, and perhaps that was how the gods endured, not as beings demanding sacrifice, but as presences hidden in instinct, the awe one feels before a storm, the unease in the forest at dusk, the comfort in a fire's warmth. These were the last languages they spoke. Today, archaeologists unearth fragments, a buried idol, a carved stone, a hammer worn thin, and call them artifacts. But each carries a ghost of sound, the hum of prayers once said aloud, the murmur of belief fading into the wind. The silence of the gods is not emptiness, it is waiting, because in the north, nothing truly dies. It freezes, and waits for spring. Centuries passed, and the gods did not return, yet their silence was not a void. It was an echo that refused to fade. The north changed slowly, as the earth does, not in bursts, but in long patient shifts. The forests that had once concealed shrines now surrounded parish churches, bells replaced horns, crosses stood where hammers had hung. But beneath those stones, the soil remembered. When men dug to lay new foundations, they sometimes found fragments, a carved face, a weathered amulet, a rusted offering knife, traces of prayers that had turned to dust, and in that soil, the old rhythm still beat. Winter still came with its endless dark. People still gathered around fires to tell stories through the long nights, and in those stories the gods awoke again, not as masters to be feared, but as memories to be spoken of softly. Odin became a wanderer of words, not of worlds. Thor became thunder itself, his hammer, the sound of sky striking sky. Freyja became the name for beauty too powerful to describe. They were no longer gods, they were language. In the low huts of farmers and fishermen, these names lived on, worn down by time, reshaped by tongues, but still alive. When thunder rolled across the mountains, a child would ask, "Who is that?" And an old voice would answer, "It is Thor, chasing trolls again." When the wind carried the scent of pine and sea, an elder might murmur, "Njord still breathes there." These were not beliefs, they were habits of thought, inherited rhythms, gentle ways of remembering, without worshipping. Historians call it syncretism, the blending of old and new faiths. But to those who lived it, there was no blending, only living. They prayed to Christ, and thanked the land spirits in the same breath. They went to church on Sundays, and still lit candles for Yule. They believed in heaven, but left food for ghosts. In Icelandic sagas, written long after the conversion, the gods appear not as deities but as ancestors of myth. Odin becomes a wise king from an age before time. Thor, a mighty hero. Their divine acts are retold as deeds of men. The stories shrink in scale but grow in number, multiplying through retellings like ripples on still water. And yet, something remains unchanged. The rhythm you can hear beneath every tale: night, offering, waiting, dawn. It is the rhythm of endurance. It is the heartbeat of a people who learned to live with darkness. The gods once demanded it through ritual, now the land itself teaches it through seasons. Each winter feels eternal, each spring a fragile miracle. The gods no longer take or give, they simply are, hidden in the cycle itself. Scholars sometimes call this period the mythic sleep, the long dormancy of belief that survived only in story and superstition. But dormancy is not death. In the quiet centuries of the Middle Ages, when plagues came and wars passed, when kings rose and fell, when parchment replaced runestone, the myths adapted. Odin reappeared in new guises, as the wise wanderer in folk tales, as the spectral horseman in storms. Thor became the guardian of crops and hearths. Loki, the trickster, became the explanation for sudden mischief, lost keys, spoiled milk, a broken roof tile after wind. And even when the church frowned upon such stories, they endured, not as acts of rebellion, but as ways of naming the unexplainable. In Norway and Sweden, peasants still spoke of Nis, small, unseen helpers who lived in barns. They wore red caps and demanded bowls of porridge at Yule, refused them, and misfortune followed. Scholars now trace them back to the Landvætter, the land spirits of the old faith. What had once been worship became courtesy. The relationship between human and unseen did not end. It merely changed shape. Every myth that slept found a new dream to live in. In the long nights, women spun wool and told stories to keep their hands moving. Men carved wooden figures, saints, angels, animals, some of which looked suspiciously like older gods beneath their new paint. Children learned that the forests were haunted, but not by devils. The old word lingered, holder folk, hidden people, not cursed, merely secret. And so, belief dissolved into imagination, and imagination became inheritance. When Icelandic poets centuries later began to write again of the old gods, it was no longer with fear. The Poetic Edda and Prose Edda were not manuals of worship, they were preservation. Snorri Sturluson, writing in the 13th century, captured the old myths, not because he believed them, but because he understood their power. They were part of the air itself. His pages carried the last breath of an age, when thunder had meaning, when night was a cathedral, when the gods spoke in weather and silence. Through his pen, the gods continued their long sleep, no longer prayed to, but remembered, studied, admired. And across the centuries, that remembrance grew roots. By the 19th century, when scholars of Europe began to rediscover the sagas, the myths stirred again. They became symbols of culture, of nationhood, of something distinct and northern. Artists painted Odin as a brooding sage, Thor as a defiant warrior, Freyja as tragic beauty. Poets spoke of the northern light as divine inspiration. It was a new kind of worship, not of gods, but of memory. The long sleep of the myths had done something strange. It had preserved them in purity. They were no longer tied to politics, sacrifice, or survival. They had become the art of the North, the mythology of endurance itself. Even today, the rhythm remains. The seasons still follow the old pattern. Night deepens, offerings are made, not to gods, but to meaning itself. We wait, and dawn comes again. Odin, Thor, Freyja, they have become words. Yes, but words are alive, in a different way. Spoken softly in the dark, they carry the weight of all those winters, all those fires, all those hearts that once believed. Their temples are gone, their priests forgotten, but their silence remains, not empty, but full. The gods, it seems, have not died. They have simply learned to sleep longer than men. The gods had long been asleep, wrapped not in prayer, but in the silence of soil and stone. When they awoke, it was not to hymns, but to the scrape of iron against earth. It began, as most rediscoveries do, by accident. Farmers turning their fields, workmen digging for roads, children finding shapes where only dirt should be. The North, that patient keeper of memory, began to exhale its secrets. From the cold, wet ground emerged fragments of a world that had once spoken to gods. At first, the finds seemed simple, a brooch here, a rusted blade there, but soon came stranger things. Buried stones carved with curling runes, figures with eyes wide open, lips pursed in eternal whisper, hammer-shaped pendants worn thin by centuries of touch. And then the ships. Long before men dug canals and cities, the Vikings had sent their dead to rest, as if the sea itself were heaven. Whole ships filled with gifts, with tools, with animals, sometimes even with other human remains. They buried them beneath mounds of earth, pointing toward the horizon, as if expecting them to sail again when the dawn returned. When the archaeologists of the 19th and early 20th centuries unearthed these mounds, at Gokstad, at Oseberg, at Thun, they were unprepared for the scale of devotion they found. The Oseberg ship, unearthed in 1904 from a hill in Norway, held two women, richly dressed, surrounded by offerings, woven tapestries, carved sleighs, intricately worked wood that seemed almost alive in its twisting detail. Even in death, they had been given beauty as armor. It was not just a burial, it was belief made visible. Each discovery revealed that what the sagas had described in poetry was not imagination, but memory. The rituals, the care, the craftsmanship, all spoke of a people who saw no boundary between life and faith. Their world was not divided into sacred and mundane. The sacred was in everything. Every carving, every nail, every ring bore meaning. In the damp air of burial chambers, archaeologists found bowls still holding traces of food, hair combs, woven blankets, even seeds. The dead, it seemed, would need comfort where they were going. The living had sent them prepared, trusting that the gods would meet them halfway. When researchers uncovered the temple site at Uppåkra in southern Sweden, a quiet hill that had lain under farmland for centuries, they found layers upon layers of offerings, gold foil figures, beads, weapon fragments, animal bones, blackened by ritual fire. The site had been used for nearly 1,000 years, and at its heart stood the remains of a great hall, rebuilt time after time on the same spot, as if the ground itself demanded continuity. Archaeologists handled the artifacts with gloved reverence. Each small piece, a god's likeness no bigger than a thumb, a cup engraved with spirals, a pendant shaped like a serpent, seemed to hum faintly with old intent. These were not relics of war or commerce. They were gestures of belief, frozen in soil. The transition from myth to evidence did not make the gods less real. It only changed how they spoke. Under microscopes, the patterns on bone and wood revealed hands that had known repetition, carvers, priests and makers who had shaped not art but devotion. The gods' faces, once painted in color now long gone, looked back through time, human, solemn, ambiguous, not angels, not demons. Something older, something that belonged entirely to the land. In 1999, at Frösö in Sweden, the runestone that marks the Christianization of the region was re-examined. Its inscription declared, Osma the son of Goodfast, had this stone raised and this bridge made, and he made the people Christian. Yet beneath that declaration lay older stones, buried deeper, stones that spoke a different language. One faith had built itself quite literally upon another. There was no anger in the earth, only memory. To walk through the museums of Oslo or Stockholm today, to stand before the Oseberg ship's curved prow or the Gotland picture stones, is to enter a quiet dialogue with those who once lived by myth. The wood creaks faintly, the carvings of serpents and riders seem to shift with the light. You realize the people who made them did not think of eternity as distance. Eternity was simply the ability to be remembered. Each artifact is a sentence from a story we almost forgot how to read, and still the land keeps secrets. Beneath bogs and forests lie thousands of sites yet untouched, sealed by frost and moss. Now and then, erosion or construction exposes something new, an idol, a weapon, a burial mound. Each time, the same hush falls over those who find it, because even now, digging into the ground feels like intruding on a sacred place. The archaeologists who study these remains often describe a peculiar quiet during excavation. Birds stop calling, the air feels heavier, tools sound muted in the soil. It is as if the land itself listens while its memories are uncovered. The gods asleep so long, stir faintly when touched by human hands again. Some finds defy easy explanation. Wooden figures with strange abstract shapes, masks carved from tree roots, stones arranged in circles with no apparent purpose. They may have been altars, idols, or simply markers of time. But to those who unearth them, they are more than data. They are messages written in an alphabet of silence. As carbon dating and modern imaging techniques advanced, science peeled back the centuries, but what it revealed was not absence of faith, but proof of its depth. Every burial mound, every tool, every ornament, testified to an existence in which belief was not a matter of doctrine but of atmosphere. The Vikings breathed it as they breathed the northern wind, and perhaps that is why the gods never truly disappeared. They were carved into the world itself, into its stones, its wood, its wind. The archaeologists did not rediscover lost idols, they rediscovered the memory of awe. Today scholars still debate the meanings of these artifacts. Was that figure of wood Odin, or a local spirit? Was the buried woman a queen, or a priestess? Was the ship meant to carry her soul, or to preserve her story? The answers, like the myths themselves, resist certainty. In that resistance lies the beauty of the old faith. It was never about knowing, it was about listening. The archaeologists, bending low in the dark soil, listening to the hum of centuries, have become a new kind of priesthood. They read runes in the ground instead of on stone. Their tools are brushes, not blades. Their offerings are time, patience, and reverence. And as they work, something passes between past and present, the same exchange that once rose in smoke and song. The gods, it seems, still receive, though now their worshippers wear gloves and carry notebooks. When the ships were first unearthed, some locals warned the workers to be careful, to disturb the dead gently, or risk storms and misfortune. Old habits, they said, die hard. The archaeologists smiled politely, but when thunder rolled later that week, some of them, quietly, stopped digging. Not in fear, in respect, because even in the modern age, the North still knows when it is being watched. Night always returns to the North. Long, slow, endless night, the same darkness that once wrapped around the fires of the old world. It was in that darkness the gods were born, and it is in that darkness they remain. For all the sagas, all the stone carvings, all the myths that men have tried to hold on to, there is one truth that endures. The Viking gods never demanded perfection. They demanded remembrance. The old faith was not built on obedience. It was built on presence, on seeing the divine, in storm, in sea, in iron, in blood. The gods of the North were never distant kings seated in light. They were wind and thunder, wolf and raven, the warmth of a hearth and the silence of a grave. They did not promise safety, they promised meaning. When people prayed to Odin, they did not ask for mercy, they asked for wisdom, even if it cost an eye. When they called to Thor, it was not to beg for peace, but to stand firm in the storm. When they whispered to Freyja, they did not seek escape from death, but the courage to meet it beautifully. These were not gods of comfort, they were gods of endurance. Even in the quiet of archaeological museums, under glass, behind ropes, something of that spirit still hums. You can feel it standing before a sword that has slept in the earth for 1,000 years. You can feel it in the curve of a ship that once carried the dead across imagined seas. The air seems heavier, expectant, as if the old gods are listening still, curious to see who remembers their names, because remembrance to them is worship. The Norse never built great temples of marble or gold. Their sanctuaries were groves, lakes, stones, and firelight. Their offerings were mead poured into the soil, or a whispered name carried on wind. Faith was not a weekly ritual. It was a way of seeing. To honor the gods was to live bravely, to die with dignity, to tell stories that would outlast breath, and perhaps that is what they still demand. When the fires of history burn low, when museums close and scholars argue over meaning, the gods remain, not as idols, but as echoes. They survive in our words, in the symbols still worn around necks, in the stories retold under new stars. They live in the restless curiosity that drives us to dig into the past, to touch the soil where they once walked. They live in the persistence of wonder, for every generation that looks back, searching for the truth of what was believed. Something ancient stirs, a memory, not of power, but of reverence. The same kind that made our ancestors lift their faces to the sky when thunder rolled, not in fear, but in awe. That awe is all the gods ever asked for. Even as Christianity swept through the North, even as new symbols replaced the old, the transition was not erasure, it was transformation. The gods were not defeated, they were absorbed, remembered differently. The same courage once offered to Thor became the courage of saints. The same longing for wisdom once prayed to Odin found its way into the scriptures. The same love of life, of earth, of sacrifice, endured beneath new names. The North has always known how to remember through change. When the last Viking temples fell, when the last runes were carved, the people still lit fires through winter. They still sang to the sky when the first snow fell. They still whispered blessings over their dead. The words changed. The gods did not, and even now, when we speak of resilience, when we honor bravery, when we look to the horizon and feel something vast stirring, we echo the same faith. Not in gods with names, perhaps, but in the same defiant human spirit that once called to them. The gods no longer need offerings of blood or gold. They need only what they have always needed, to be remembered when the night grows long, when the world feels cold, when silence presses close. To sit before a fire, to tell their stories again, is enough. For in the old belief, remembrance is creation. Every time their names are spoken, they breathe again. Every time their stories are told, the north stirs in its sleep. The wind shifts. The darkness listens. That is the true afterlife of the gods, not in the halls of Valhalla, but in the minds of those who still care to remember. So when you look upon a carved hammer, or a weathered rune, or the outline of a burial mound under moonlight, pause. The gods are not gone. They are waiting, not for worship, not for sacrifice, only for memory. Because in memory lies peace, and peace was the one thing they never had while they were alive in men's hearts. The gods, like the people who created them, longed for something lasting, and at last, through the remembering of the living, they have found it. The dark of night remains their realm, but now when the fire burns low and the world grows still, they are no longer feared, they are at rest.